Through our explorations, we've seen many examples of what we consider reset compounds. How exactly does one go about surviving a reset? It's a question that we've considered in all these explorations, and yet we may not have realized that we've already looked at many of these compounds. Now let's look at them directly.
I'm no sorcerer, but I'll gladly test your steel, old friend.
In the Five Eras theory, we spend a lot of our exploration time between the Fourth and the Fifth Era, and this is because we have the most remaining evidence. We have to consider that the Fourth Era, or the civilization that preceded ours that we call Tartaria on this channel, had advance warning of the pending collapse of their civilization and their society. And indeed, looking closely at the Fourth Era timeline itself, we see in the three phases the final phase concluded with its decline and fall. They clearly knew that their civilization was falling. Now, they may not have known the exact details behind it any more than we do, but we have suspicions. It was a conflict, it was some sort of calamity, a disaster, a flood, a deluge, plasma rain, many different theories as we do see these examples across the land. And yet somehow the civilization did know that they were falling, and they no doubt took precautions to try to facilitate the survival of many individuals within their society. But one dark question that we have to consider is, was the civilization operating on the same mentality that it was earlier, or had it been infiltrated by the forces that they were indeed engaged in conflict against? We have evidence for both, but we see that when a civilization's falling fast, your best option is to design and build survival compounds. And even though we're looking at a state hospital, we see that this state hospital has a powerhouse, a bakery, a warehouse, a laundry, a carpenter shop, and what they considered an occupational therapy building, but is no doubt some sort of workshop that was repurposed. So consider this. While this may be what we see as a hospital, it had all the details needed for a survival compound, a compound that is off the grid, has the capability to sustain human beings, has the ability to generate its own power, has the ability to provide food and sustenance, and yet live off the grid. Now, we don't know exactly what details they were facing with the disaster. It's clear they were aware that their society was about to collapse and they were going to be cut off. And as we've seen in a lot of post-apocalyptic literature, we see that having these compounds, such as the compound in Mad Max 2 or the Road Warrior, as it's known as in the United States, we find many examples of what these compounds are. Elaborate structures that took a lot of effort. Some were clearly built better than others. Now we know what many of these structures would become once the Fifth Era civilization arose. They would be repurposed into many different institutions that we consider asylums. Whether they're asylums for people we're told were mentally ill, soldiers' asylums, orphanages, and even universities, civic centers. They've been repurposed into many different things. But keep the perspective that we're in the Fourth Era and we're actually looking at these structures and the challenge that they faced. It's clear that some were built better than others. Some they had a little bit more time to plan out and put a little bit more effort. And we're certainly not aware of what their actual construction techniques were or how long it would have taken them to actually erect one of these structures. Perhaps they could have done it in a very short amount of time. But we do see a variance in the quality of construction and also the number of buildings. For example, this isolated asylum in Kansas no doubt could have been an effort by the locals at the time, at the end of the Fourth Era, to try to establish some sort of survival building, and that's why we see some that are isolated. Or perhaps the subsidiary buildings were torn down or lost over time. The reason we have so much evidence, though, with these compounds is that you tend to see a large group of old-world buildings that are all kept together. And this suddenly explains all these asylums and the well-constructed main building that they have, along with all the subsidiary buildings, having their own power source, their own ability to live off the grid, generate food, water, and sustain people for an indefinite period of time. Many are also geographically isolated. And because of that, that's probably the reason why we could say that they were originally intended to be survival compounds. They knew that their society was collapsing. They didn't know exactly what they were facing, though. Was it this adversary that we've posited in other explorations that the Fourth Era civilization was facing? Or did they even know that they were going to face some sort of terrifying natural calamity? Were they aware of some sort of plasma rain, or the very nature of the land changing in ways we can't imagine? Most of our current experiences with our literature always talk about surviving nuclear destruction. But perhaps this society faced something very different. I mean, you could make the argument that a lot of these compounds are not very defensible. But Perhaps they're not defensible from the weapons that we think of. Another disturbing question that we don't often consider is, if direct firearms and firearms are considered the greatest weapons, then why are we allowed to have them so freely? Perhaps there are other sorts of weapons out there that are far more terrifying, far more destructive, and yet at the same time far more controlled in the application of the destructive capability. Think about that with the different types of destruction that we've seen, widespread and yet some very localized. Back to the concept of the reset compounds, though, we still have many of these facilities all over the land, and we have explored them very extensively. Many were initially repurposed to become our lunatic asylums in the 1800s, or the time frame after we believe the reset really occurred. Although we don't know for sure, there seems to be a lot of evidence that there were many of these compounds that were remaining, they were fully intact, and then they already happened to be geographically isolated. So, as they were imposing the plan of conflict, assimilation, and indoctrination for the Fifth Era civilization, these former reset compounds that ironically facilitated survival were now going to be repurposed as concentration camps, as exclusion camps to send people who were not properly assimilating into this new civilization of the Fifth Era. Or in more direct terms, they were not accepting the fact that things had changed and that they had a different knowledge and awareness of a previous civilization. So they were sent to these former survival compounds that were now repurposed as insane asylums, as they were called, eventually changed to the more gentle name of mental hospitals as years went on, but ultimately serving the same purpose. And indeed, we can see that in our recent history, it wasn't until the 1970s, the 1980s, relatively recently, that the original purpose and function of these mental hospitals was finally dropped. And yet you can see with the variance in construction when we look at different mental hospitals, some are more well constructed than others. Others seem to have the same geometric precision on their interiors. And this is not something we'd expect to see in the 1800s, even for what is supposed to be an altruistic Kirkbride plan that was designed to facilitate the mental health and well-being of all the patients that were sent there. And indeed, you might recall when we did our explorations, we found that there was any slew of reasons going down to not liking someone as being an acceptable reason to have someone committed to a mental asylum in the 1800s. But looking at some of the other structures, and now that we consider that these are actually survival compounds and seeing the variance in construction, this suddenly explains this. This explains the fact that we do have this variance in construction. It seems that some were more prioritized and they had a little bit more detail put into the architecture. They also seem to have been more well equipped with some of what we would call antiquitech, or power generation capability. It seemed as though they possessed different aspects of power generation, as though there were redundancies that were factored into these survival compounds. And again, this all makes sense because of the fact that you need these survival compounds to stand up to all sorts of different challenges, all sorts of different considerations. But when you look at them, you can see that they have all the aspects of the hints of technology that we've seen in many of the other old world buildings that we've explored that still remain in the cities. But you really have to consider this aspect that these survival compounds were geographically isolated. So it gives the impression, it gives us many clues that the previous civilization was facing many different threats. There was clearly an existential threat that was threatening them in their main population centers. And so it seems that the population had to disperse to try to facilitate their survival. And this is reflected in many of the post-apocalyptic literature that we've seen. And you can even find it in the whole concept of fallout shelters, survival compounds, and even to this day with the survivalist mentality. Now, I'm not conducting this exploration to try to say that we're going to figure out when the next reset's going to happen or anything like that, and that we should panic. We're simply looking for what happened in the past to develop a better awareness. And then it's up to all of us as individuals with what we're going to do with that awareness. But I believe that the theory that these compounds were originally survival compounds to get the last civilization survivors through the reset makes a lot more sense than some other purpose for these buildings. Now, it is possible that these buildings or portions of these compounds did have a very different purpose when they were originally constructed in the Fourth Era civilization, and then they were repurposed to be survival compounds. So think about that. Let's just take the St. Elizabeth's Hospital, for example. Originally it was constructed as something akin to a hotel in the Fourth Era civilization. They knew that the downfall of their civilization was coming rapidly, so they repurposed it to a reset compound. because it was well constructed and it had a lot of the infrastructure to survive the reset. After the reset, it was then repurposed again into a hospital and an asylum. And indeed, we can take this to the final conclusion where some of these mental asylums are even being repurposed back into hospitals in our current civilization. So consider this. These buildings are so well built, so well constructed, that they're able to survive all sorts of calamities. They're able to survive vast changes within what they face in their environment, and they're able to survive existential threats. We don't exactly know what sort of weapons were available and used towards the end of the Fourth Era, but it seems clear that there was all sorts of different types of destructive weapons that could cause the complete collapse of buildings even built as well as this. And yet we can still see some newer examples of construction and architecture, and perhaps these are the structures that were built in a more hasty manner to try to facilitate the survival of the survivors of the Fourth Era civilization. The other more disturbing aspect, though, when we consider the fall of the Fourth Era civilization, is that these asylums were all over the land. Every single major continent has some form of asylum or some form of large compound, a compound typically being built around a large main administration building. And indeed, when you look at asylums in the United States or across the land, you'll always notice that they seem to have an old main building. Many universities and old colleges have the old main building. It's the central building on the compound. It's the main administration building. Or perhaps it was originally the command center for the survival compound. It's going to be your best constructed building. It's going to be your most defensible building. Now you may be thinking, okay, but not from the firearms perspective. But as I said, perhaps they had entirely different considerations than firearms. If they had some sort of sound-based technology, if there was some reason to establish a standoff in the terrain or be isolated, we have to think along those lines. Now, again, it's all theories, could be completely incorrect about this. But it is rather strange that we have so many of these compounds that are very definitive old world buildings. And it's not just the main building, but many of the supporting buildings are also old world buildings. That we have examples of the fact that these are true survival compounds, and that's the way they were originally intended. And indeed, many seem to have been built from the ground up, the very start, to be survival compounds. I'm reminded of the entire concept of the vaults in the Fallout universe, and if you've never played the Fallout games, it's a post-apocalyptic, it was originally a PC game from the 1990s, based and inspired on the Mad Max concept, and what we saw was civilization knew they were facing a nuclear war, or their version of a reset, and so their means to survive it included constructing underground vaults. Now, on that note, I'm well aware that most of these facilities we're looking at are above ground. But we can see exactly how isolated they are, such as this one in Cherokee, Iowa, one of the most geographically isolated asylums that we've seen until you go out into the west where it's even more isolated. But if you think along those concepts about the fact that many of these large compounds are built in essentially the middle of nowhere, and if their intention was indeed to survive many different forces trying to eradicate the remaining population, it suddenly makes a lot more sense. Now, we do know, and we just explored many catacombs underneath the major cities across the land, not just in the United States, and so it seems as though there was an underground and above ground component for this. Now, in a more insidious note, could it have been possible that there were people who were taken into these compounds, and much as we saw in the plot line of the Fallout series, the vaults were actually not truly for the survival of people. They were merely to take people to experiment on them in many different sort of crazed social and medical experiments. And yet, ironically, we'd also see that these compounds, once they are repurposed into asylums, that's exactly the function that they served. And so what it gives us a clue towards is that perhaps the Fourth Era civilization, their leaders, their administration, had already been infiltrated by the forces that they were battling. And indeed, we suspect that's the reason for their collapse. When you look at how well constructed the compound, or the mental asylum, or the hospital as it's known now in Cherokee, Iowa truly is, while considering how isolated this location truly is, it gives many different clues to what was going on. We can see that there was some very definitive effort put into its construction. It was to survive a long time, and it still stands to this day, the entire structure and the entire compound. And yet the geographical isolation, it's a terrifying concept to imagine a scared population facing their extermination, trying to seek solace. And yet, when we see the many fortresses and many of the hasty efforts that still exist to this day, that we know would do no good against an invading army, because an invading army could simply isolate them and engage in siege warfare and starve out the population. Unless, of course, many of these compounds were well equipped. Many of the fortresses that we see were equipped to survive for an indefinite number of years, or they had the ability to sustain themselves. It points to many different possibilities, and we're going to be exploring exactly what we believe happened towards the end of the Fourth Era civilization, because we do have many clues, as I said, that indicate that they were facing an existential threat. Now, looking at the Independence Hospital in Independence, Iowa, we see probably one of the most finest constructed facilities or survival compounds. And I wanted to zero in on this one because we did actually do an on-site exploration, and it's probably the best example of a reset compound that had a lot of effort put into it. And looking initially, what we're told is that the exterior walls of this facility are constructed of what's called Anamosa limestone. Now consider this. The official history tells us that this was originally built as a mental asylum in Iowa in the 1870s. And there was a vast need for it because the original asylum in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, which is in the southeastern portion of the state, was overcrowded. So somehow they managed to build not just this main administration building, but this entire compound with its own power generation capability and ability to live off the grid. Yes, in the 1870s, we're told, although, of course, the official history will tell us that the subsidiary buildings came later, with this sort of interior on it. Does this really make any sense if they're going to put this kind of effort into an asylum that they have a rapid need for? Or does it make more sense that this was either built from the ground up to be a reset compound, or perhaps this was some sort of wondrous hotel or retreat in the Fourth Era civilization that was repurposed into a reset compound, and then after the reset it was repurposed again into an asylum. Indeed, when you look at many of the images and you see just how well constructed the interior of this building is, having this sort of theory suddenly explains a lot of these conflicting aspects that we see with these mental asylums. And you could apply the same paradigm to universities, civic centers, any sort of compound across the land. There's also the underground aspect. Considering how the underground is facilitated in the Independence Hospital or the Independence Asylum in Iowa, it makes a lot more sense that someone would use this to try to facilitate their survival, that there was some reason that they couldn't be outside or above ground. This compound actually gives you the ability to attend to both. You can be above ground or you can be below ground, and you have the capability to survive whatever threats that you're facing. When you look at the size and immensity of the Independence Asylum in Iowa, it's not just the fact in how well constructed the main building is that strikes you. You also find out just how much territory this is really taking up, how much ground and how much area that they have for this entire compound. And when you visit it in person, you can actually witness just how well constructed it is. Now, I don't know for sure. Was it originally a structure in the Fourth Era that was repurposed to be a reset compound? Or was it something that they put a little bit more time and effort into to construct and make sure that it was going to stand up to whatever threats that it was potentially facing? Perhaps they knew that there was some sort of plasma fire, or dare I say, some sort of sound or energy weapon that was going to be employed, and only a certain type of construction would have been able to stand up to those threats. And yet to this day, when you look at the construction materials, you can see that it matches the fine-tuned construction of the Iowa State Capitol itself. And it was actually built in the exact same time frame according to our official history, and yet it's still standing in total perfection. The structure itself is not eroded in any way, shape, or form. And we're well aware that this far north in Iowa, it faces challenges from the weather every year. And let's not forget about the tornadoes, the difficult winters, and many other aspects. And it still stands and functions to this day as a hospital. But originally we're told that it was a mental hospital in the 1870s. And there are many subsidiary buildings that support this structure. It's not just the main building. So suddenly, this becomes an idea of a civilization that saw what was happening. A terrifying note that they did have some forewarning of what was about to happen. Perhaps they were involved in some sort of conflict that they realized that they were not going to win, and there were still some aspects within their civilization that had good intentions to try to attempt to allow the population to survive. Or, on a darker note, perhaps most of their leadership was already compromised by some sort of internal corruption, and they merely decided to send the people here, and indeed also to the underground survival catacombs, to be experimented on, or worse, just simply killed. Now, you might be asking, why would someone go to all the effort to do this? It seems if you're going to completely destroy and reset a society, one of the best ways to do it would be to completely disorient the population. And one of the things we have to consider that we haven't, because it's frankly not exactly an optimistic consideration, is that the examinations on the population that were done before the reset. That the dark intentions were employed even before the complete collapse of the Fourth Era civilization. There seem to be a lot of indications that many of the main institutions in the infrastructure of the Fourth Era civilization had already been infiltrated and corrupted. Because if they really had the capability to build these buildings, and they really had the concept of unity within their civilization, then they should have been able to fend off this threat. And indeed, we do suspect that they did win the first conflict, and that was in the second phase of the Fourth Era civilization. We call it Tartaria on this channel, but that's just simply a name association. At the end of the day, we don't know exactly what their civilization was called, or even what language they spoke. And maybe they only spoke one primary language. Or maybe they had an entirely different means of communicating that we don't understand. But we still see these structures standing, and they defy our ability to replicate to this day. Now, you'll have some people that argue that, yes, we could achieve building structures like this. Really? Could we? You also need to examine the construction materials when you're on these old asylums, and Independence Hospital in Iowa is one of the best examples, because it's not just the main building, but you have multiple buildings that show more advanced construction techniques that are holding up just perfectly to this day. And on the sidewalk just below where you're walking here is one of the main tunnels that connects the primary administration building to one of the subsidiary buildings. So it's very clear that they put a lot of effort into this structure. And it seems to me that this was something that was built from the ground up as a reset compound. Now, I could be wrong, but the fact that there's so much thought put into the infrastructure, the layout, and the life support capabilities for this particular compound, it does support those conclusions. And it suddenly comes across as a more darker aspect for what's really behind these reset compounds. There's also the example of St. Keta, one of the channel's very first explorations, and now that I go back and consider that with different eyes and what we've learned in our explorations, I realize that St. Keta was another reset compound. Perhaps not as well constructed as the one in Independence, Iowa, but it seems to have been designed from the ground up as a reset compound. Because it does have its own power source, it does have its own ability to live off the grid. We're told that it was founded by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi, and it was originally supposed to be a school to assist with developmentally challenged children. But we can see when we look at the exploration footage that there are many different structures that show many different construction styles. Now, is it possible that when it was repurposed into a school to support and assist developmentally challenged children, that they added a few buildings with the Fifth Era construction capabilities? Absolutely. Does that happen in every single university and every single compound that were originally survival compounds or reset compounds? You better believe it. Because everywhere you look, you can see different forms of construction. You can tell where the old world buildings really are. So these reset compounds serve a multitude of purposes for us now as we conduct these explorations and try to put together the pieces of what we had with our Fourth Era civilization going into the Fifth Era civilization. You have, in a very relatively confined geographical location, examples of different types of buildings. You can see true old world buildings, but then you can also see more of the newer buildings. For example, if you go to a university, you'll find that a university that still has its old main building standing tends to be the nicest, most beautiful, and most bona fide old world building on the institution. But then they have newer buildings that they build. The brutalist architecture buildings, which is where they tend to house the history department in their university. So it suddenly answers many of these questions, and this theory does address the fact that we do have reset compounds that are all over the land. And wherever you are, whether in the United States, Australia, Southeast Asia, Europe, it doesn't really matter, you can find examples of these compounds. Now, they do have different aspects to them, and they may be laid out in different ways. But the baseline aspect of it and the repurposing of these compounds in the Fifth Era seems to be something that's reflected across the land. I mean, is this really a grotto that was put together by just a few Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi? Did they also build that large structure by themselves and all these supporting structures? A lot of it doesn't make sense, and indeed we also recall the story of the large convents, which could also have been reset compounds originally, that were repurposed. Now, I'm not saying that in the subsequent years that the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi did not do good and did not engage in their altruistic pursuits as we're told that they were, but I find it hard to believe that they were able to pull off the construction of all these buildings. And indeed, going back to the example of St. Keta, something else that'll surprise you is just how extensive, just how much terrain and space that all the buildings in the compound take up. When you consider the example of St. Keta, you have to realize that while there's the main building, the administration building is 1.5 miles away, and the fastest way to reach it is driving by car. And so suddenly when you realize the spread out nature of some of these compounds and just how self-sustaining and supporting that they really are, and their layout with the buildings being in different locations and having different purposes, and then being repurposed for newer purposes, it suddenly provides explanations for why we have all these vast compounds that contain many old world buildings, yet they're very isolated at the same time. Consider the example of any university. And what were reset compounds repurposed into? They were repurposed into universities, asylums, hospitals, civic centers, others. There's the underground aspect to them. And we also consider the vault tech concept. And while that may be darker, perhaps these compounds were originally designed as some sort of experiment, if indeed the leadership of the Fourth Era civilization was compromised, as we have indications that it does. Well, I hope you enjoyed this exploration. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.
Apparently, our lovely ladies whacked the caretaker.